Great. So I mentioned the webinar today is about building data dashboards, and we've got a variety of different data sources which will often have our information in. That might be in SharePoint, it might be in databases, Excel. I read recently had more data in it than any other database in the world combined. And also the Microsoft Graph. There's increasingly a number of different apps available in the Microsoft 365 ecosystem, and there's data in all sorts of those, whether that's email, events, tasks, files, or even user information as well. And one of the challenges, I've been a consultant for over 15 years now. One of the challenges I've always been tasked to try and do is present that single view of something, the single view of your project, the single view of your customer, the single view of your business. And it's quite challenging to pull together that data from various disparate data sources. And we're going to look at how we do that using QuizCom's data view tools for SharePoint Online. It's a set of SPFX web parts. At its core is the Data View Plus app, which is a combination of all of the other apps, as well as having the ability to support custom controls. So we've got the app, the QuizCom List View Plus app, which can take data from a SharePoint list, but manipulate it and present it in so many interesting ways beyond what you can do natively. We've got the List Aggregator, which lets us aggregate data from multiple different SharePoint sites into a single view. Then there's a number of other apps, such as the Picture Gallery, Org Chart, and then we'll also have a look at using the calendar today. The extra thing we're going to be introducing today is also the Shelled Filter app, which will allow us to filter data across multiple web parts. So if any of you remember things like web part connections from earlier versions of SharePoint on premises, it's similar sorts of ideas, but I'll walk you through that. Now, the key thing which I'm going to emphasize today is the QuizCom data view apps, and actually all of the QuizCom apps, are designed for end users, so non-technical users. These are designed to work in the browser. It's someone who's building a solution in their specific site. You can configure these apps in a few minutes. There's both a simple and an advanced mode. So if you want to do some slightly more complicated things, you can do, but there's also some default simple setups available for you. And you don't need a separate tool to configure things. You don't need to do any coding or anything like that to configure everything. And even where there might be areas of scripting, QuizCom make available various samples for you to use. So I mentioned we're talking about data and different data sources. And within the Data View Plus app, we can connect to a variety of different data sources, whether that's data in SharePoint, whether that's within our own site or across other sites in my site collection, or completely different site collections. So very relevant for the modern world of SharePoint in online, where we're discouraged from having all of our data in a single site, and we're encouraged to break that out across multiple different sites. As I mentioned, we often have data in Excel. Sometimes we want to leverage SharePoint search to find and discover data. And then we want to maybe go further afield into the world of Microsoft 365 by leveraging the graph. And I'm going to show you a few examples. I've just got a few screenshots here just to set the scene. So the QuizCom Data View Plus app allows us to enhance SharePoint lists. We can aggregate data across multiple sites, as I said. And we can also then look at the appearance of it, whether that's by adding filters, groups, tabs, conditional formatting, or even by using completely custom controls like this risk matrix, which I'll show you during the course of the demo. There are also separate controls for different types of data. I mentioned things like org chart, which we're not going to look at today, but there are previous webinars on that topic. And then also calendar. So there's the Calendar View Plus app, which allows us to connect to calendar data, whether that's event data held in SharePoint or calendar data maybe stored in Exchange, whether it's a person's calendar or even connecting to a calendar of a specific Microsoft 365 group. We can present that calendar in a range of layouts, monthly, weekly, daily view, and add things like filters and conditional formatting as well. One of the things I talk about during the course of the demo is this sort of Lego builder style UI where you can build up different components of the app using things like filters and groupings and conditional formatting. And then we're going to look at how we implement shared filters across multiple different instances of the data view plus app, which all look at different types of data. And the shared filter is going to allow us to look and filter all of those web parts at once. So that's my introduction. Let's dive straight into a demo. I'm going to start by showing you one which is already set up, and then I'm going to show you how we go about and configure that. Let me just zoom in a little bit because my screen tends to be quite small so you can all see that. Okay. So here I've got a SharePoint page, and I've got a number of web parts on this page. I've got this filter at the top, which I'll come back to in a second. And then I've got a web part which is just displaying me some basic list information with paging in there. I've got two web parts on this left-hand side here. I've got some issues with some color coding based on priority. So the ones in red are high priority items. This data is actually connecting to an Excel spreadsheet. And then I've got some other data here for some milestones broken down and displayed as tabs in to break that up based on status. And then finally on the right hand side here, I've got this risk matrix, which is connecting to a SharePoint list of risks, but then based on certain bits of metadata within those list items, it's then placing them differently within my matrix. And at the very bottom here, we've got a calendar control displaying a number of meetings. This is actually displaying from the calendar of the user I'm using for the demo today, but it could have connected to a shared calendar as well. At the top here, we've got the shared filter app, and we can come in here and we can, for instance, search for a specific customer. Apply that filter, and you'll notice that all of the other web parts have been filtered. My summary data is filtered, my issues, my milestones, my risk matrix, and my calendar. I can filter some of those further where there's a date. So where I'm using a date on some of those web parts, I can push down a date. I can either select from my date control, or I can actually default in today and again update my filter. And then you'll notice that it's only showing me sort of date specific information on these two views. It's not affecting my risk matrix because that hasn't got any dates. And then it's also filtering my calendar for a specific date. Pretty simple, looks really nice. I can quickly enter queries here and get data which is really relevant to what I want. So if I search for a different customer, I get the correct filtered information. So how do we go about building something like that? Well, let's start at the very beginning with a blank SharePoint page. And the first thing I'll demonstrate is just how to add in that sort of simple list bit of data here. You'll actually see over here, I've got a list just containing my customers. I've got the customer name, who the owner and the city is. So on my new blank page, I just go ahead and edit that page. I've broken this up into sections to help me lay it out. And then I'm just going to come in here and I'm going to add the Data View Plus app. As I said, you can configure it pretty quickly. So I can come in here and click Configure. And then I can choose to add a data source. So in this case, I'm just going to call my data source customers. And I then define what it is I'm connecting to. So Excel, Graph, SharePoint data. So I'm going to connect to a SharePoint list. This is one thing I really like is I can immediately connect to a different site if I wanted to, but actually my list is contained within this site. I'm going to go and find that list called customers. And there's a few other options I get here, like what default view it is. And with certain data types, I might be required to do some column mapping. And I can go and set up multiple different data sources. So if I want to bring in multiple data sources and merge them together and display them in a single web part, I can do. I'm not looking to do that in this case. So you see here, I've already configured my web part and I've got some data displayed. And we can configure some basic settings around this web part, but you'll notice a lot of areas are grayed out. To access those areas, we can switch to advanced mode. And in here, we can start to edit these different components, deciding which ones we want, which ones we don't want. So for instance, if we didn't want the menu, I could just remove that completely from my web part. I can also go and change my paging. So in this case, I'll only want to display one item. And actually, I don't want any of the paging buttons displayed. So it just displays me one record. I can then also modify this list control. So at the moment, it's not quite displaying the fields of information I wanted to display. So I can go in and configure that. I can modify the subtitle here, and I can start typing in the text which I wanted to display. So I can go, this customer is based in, and then I can pull through fields from my list. So for instance, the value of the city. You can see there it's saying this customer is based in New York because that's the record value for city. And then also I want to change created by, I want to change that to just be the owner. And I'll add that in. And there we go. So I've configured my first web part. Let's just publish that and we can see the data. You'll notice on the right-hand side, I've got a series of additional buttons here. These are item-specific actions, for instance, where I can open up a properties box or launch an email or edit the item further. I can customize these actions by switching over to advanced mode and then clicking on the particular control I want to work with, again, the list control. And you see I've got a series of list item actions. So I can go and change one of those. So let's, for instance, take this one, action 3, open item in new window. I'm actually going to replace that with a map and one of the custom controls around maps. Now, you see here, there's some JavaScript code to write. If I knew how to write it, of course I could go ahead and write it, but I don't need to worry about that because QuizCom have built a number of predefined actions, and we'll see other examples of this as we move through the demo today. So I'm going to choose the one to show a map using Google Maps. And it's pretty simple. You can just go through and find where you need to be modifying it. So if you need to go and change your column value, you just go and look for that column and use a different column called other than city. But in this case, my column's already called city. If I go and republish that, you'll see my item on the page. And if I click on the map, it just loads up my map action. Okay, let's start to build this up. So next, we're going to take the issues. Okay, this is actually an aggregation of multiple different lists. Below my site, I've got a couple of subsites. This data could be in subsites, it could be in separate site collections. So I've got 2 sites for a couple of my customers. And in there, in both sites, I've got issues lists for those customers. So there's for Contoso. Go and have a look at Fabricam. You see I've also got some issues there. I want to roll up and aggregate that data into a single web part, and I can do that with the Data View Plus app. So let's go here, and I'll add the Data View Plus app. In this case, I'm changing my data source. So I'm going to call it issues because that's what it is. Then I'm going to use list aggregator on this occasion. Now here, I'm just defining my presentation. So I want to set a instance of the issues list, which controls how things are going to be presented, how things are going to be viewed. So I'm just going to pick one of the list. It doesn't matter which one, as long as they're the same. And I'm going to take issues as my base list view. At the bottom here, I'm then going to add some aggregation scopes. And in this case, you can define under what scope that aggregation is going to look at. And you can add multiple of these. So if you want to look across multiple different site collections, you can aggregate across multiple different site collections. Now, there is a scenario if you're aggregating from lots and lots and lots of site collections that for performance reasons, you may be better off using SharePoint Search. But if you've got that sort of scenario in mind, get in touch and we'll talk about the best way to build the aggregation. I've got a variety of filters here. In this case, I'm just going to base it on where the list title is issues. I'm going to enable that. I'm going to click out, and you should see my data set has started to build out. If I close this data source provider, you'll see here is my list. And if I switch to advanced mode, I can start to make a few changes. I've already used the list view, so I'm actually going to use the table layout instead to present my items as a table. If I don't like the layout of those columns, again, it puts in a default layout, but I can go in and change that. So I can say, for instance, I want title, then I want to display who the customer is, then I'm going to display the priority, and finally, I'm going to display the due date. Perfect. If we look at my example, there's a few other things I've got going on. So for instance, I've got that conditional formatting. So let's look at that. I'm not going to use paging on this occasion, so I'm just going to delete the paging altogether. And then I'm going to add in, using that Lego style build.ui, a new control for conditional formatting. And it's super easy to use. Just add a condition. I display how do I want it to look. So I'm going to look at background color. Let's pick a nice red to use to highlight it. At the moment, it's highlighted everything. Don't worry. We've got some options around presenting it. Firstly, we format it. Pick a specific column if we wanted to. We could do it on a specific row or the column altogether. I didn't mean to pick title. I meant to pick priority. And then we can also add conditions. We can add multiple conditions. In this case, I'm only interested where the item priority is high. And you can go in and build up multiple conditional formatting rules which you want to apply. Let's have a look at the result of that. You can see that's formatted. It also even gives me a selector on my conditional formatting to decide whether I want to include or not include those items. Okay, so rolling up data from multiple lists with some conditional formatting. I think I built that in a couple of minutes. That was pretty neat, wasn't it? Let's go and have a look at some of the other examples. So I've got this control here, which is displaying me data in a tabbed form. And I think I mentioned that that's actually pulling from a Excel file. So if I go to my documents library, you'll see I've got an Excel file here with a series of project milestones in, because we might hold some of that data in Excel and want to bring that into our dashboard. It's worth mentioning that this is also part of a table, and that makes it much easier when I'm selecting my data. So let's go and configure that. So if I edit my page, I'm now going to add another web part. I'm going to add the data view plus. I'm going to add a data source. In this case, I'm adding milestones, and I'm going to go and choose an Excel file, and it will ask me to either upload or select an existing Excel file. I'm going to select that one. In a second, I'll be able to go and choose my table or data sheet. Now, in this case, I will need to do some column mapping because I need to tell the app what type of data I'm going to be displaying. So I need to go into column display settings, and I'm going to start to add my columns. So I'm going to add a title. We can put a friendly name in. So if the column is not what you want it to be displayed in SharePoint, you can go and modify that. If it's what you want it to be, you don't need to make any changes. And I need to make sure that when I'm adding my due date, I set it as a field type as date or time. And in this case, it's only a date. Again, I can look at elements of the presentation. So for example, replacing the list control with a table. I could change things like the layout of these. And I can also, if I just maybe remove some of these controls I'm not using, come in here and I can present that data in a number of ways. I could present it as group data based on a specific grouping, and I can define what I want it to group by. Or what I'm going to use is tabs, so present it as different tabs where I can switch between the status. Pretty simple. Okay, let's go and add our last two controls, which are a little bit more complicated. The first one is this risk matrix. So if we go and have a look in SharePoint, we've got a list which contains our risks, and it manages both the probability and severity, which controls where it appears on the matrix. So I go and add my Data View Plus app. We'll quickly move through the bits which we've already looked at, which is connecting to a SharePoint list. And then in the app itself, I've obviously shown you the list and the table controls, but we also have the custom control. And this is where either you can use pre-built templates which QuizCom have built, or you can build your own custom template or work with QuizCom to implement one with you. In this case, I'm just going to insert the HTML snippet for the risk matrix. And it's pre-configured that to use specific column names. You can obviously change the snippet to use your own column names, and then to present the items at the correct place on the matrix. Finally, I'm going to go down and I'm going to add that calendar control at the bottom here. Really simple, but we're going to connect to a different data source which we haven't used so far, and that's the Microsoft Graph. We could collect and pull through files from OneDrive, user information, or other information held in the graph. In this case, we're going to connect to a calendar, and it's actually going to be the user's calendar. So you can see those calendar appointments here. So I'm going to select the Graph API. Now, don't worry if you're not fully familiar with how to connect to the Graph API. Again, QuizCom have got various samples available for you to use, including My Calendar. So that connects to My Calendar. Now, dependent on whether you're using additional properties when you're connecting to things, you might have to map those properties. You might have to do things like column mappings if you're connecting to a custom graph endpoint. But in this case, all the pre-built samples will map for you, so you don't need to do anything. There's my calendar. I can do things like apply conditional formatting here as well. I can also set things like what I want my starting view to be in terms of day, week, month, etc. So there's a number of different options I can do around the presentation of that calendar. But I'm actually just going to go with the simple standard layout which comes with the calendar app. I'm just going to publish that. And then you should see I've got all my web parts on the page now. So the only thing I'm missing is my shared filter at the top. So let's go ahead and add that. So I'm going to add another web part. In this case, I'm going to choose the shared filter web part. Okay, so there's a few things we need to do. So first of all, we need to map any columns which we want to use as part of our filter. And we do that by going to column mapping. There's a number of standard columns available, such as modifier, created by, created on, etc. But you can also go and add your own columns. So I'm going to add two. I'm going to add one for customer to allow someone to search for a customer. And then I'm going to add another one for date. You can choose to get this to map to more than one column. So say, for instance, you had telephone and you wanted it to map to business phone and mobile, cell phone, you can do. I'm going to add my second column for my date. Okay, and I'm going to close that. So those are just sort of mapped and set up and ready for me to use. And I'll be using that mapping at various points over the next minute or two. I can define some rules around my filter section, including like, do I require it to satisfy both filters or just one of the filters, as well as other layout things. So I might put filter the dashboard as my title. And then I'm going to start configuring the filters. It comes with one set up by default, which is just a search here. And I can say, well, what do I want to the column to search against? I pick my mapped column, so in this case, customer. And I can even change the wording. So I can say search for a customer. I can define what type of control it is and also what it does. In the case of a text control, equals actually means contains, so it's looking for that phrase. I can then come in here and add an additional filter. In this case, I'm going to search on my date field, which I defined. I need to make sure that my control type is a date, and you might see that I get other options here. I can also do things like hide the option for today, but actually I quite like that. I can also resize these filters, so if I want them laid out or switched around, I can do that. And I can also show my apply button. I kind of like that. So that's set up, but at the moment that's not going to go and filter anything, and that's because we need to go and do two things. On each of our web parts we want to filter, we need to set a page level filter and a data filter. And we just map our columns. So in this case, we say we're mapping customer from my shared filter to what item in my list, and in this case it will be title. I do the same for my data source, and I go into column mappings, and you'll see my mappings are available there. So I can come in here and I can choose my field title. I don't have a date on this one, so I'm not going to apply it. And I go down and I do the same on the other web parts, doing the relevant mapping. In this case, I'm filter on both customer and date, in this case, my due field. And I do exactly the same with my data source. I'm not going to subject you for watching me do that on every single one. So I'm just going to do it on a couple just to prove the point. You've obviously seen it working on the main page. So I've applied a filter to both of these two. So if I come in here now and search for Fabricam, you'll see that's filtered, and also my issues are filtered. And I can pick a date like today. Won't affect my top web part because it's not using that filter, but this one has been filtered by that date. And if I wanted to set up the rest of the page, just take another minute or two to apply those filters to the other pages, and we'll end up with a result, something like this. And that's how in about 20 minutes or so we can configure those different web parts to consume data from various locations, and then to apply a filter on top of that. Now, before we move back to any questions, just wanted to wrap up with a couple of key slides. Installation. Installation of these apps and any of the other QuizCom apps is really simple. You can go to the QuizCom website and you can actually follow the process to set up the app on your site. If you don't have permissions to that, there's also a manual installation method which you can provide to the relevant authorized individual. And so what have I shown you today? Today I've shown you how to build those interconnected data-driven dashboards, taking data from SharePoint, multiple different SharePoint lists in different sites, Excel, the graph, merging some of those data sets together, presenting them in different ways, whether that's as lists, tables, tabs, groups, applying conditional formatting, and then more complex controls like calendars or even custom risk matrices as well. And pretty much however you want to present your data, we can work with you on the best way to present that information. Importantly, everything I've shown you, I set up. I'm a semi-technical person, but I certainly is not as technical as I used to be. But everything I've shown you, you can set up in 15, 20 minutes without being a technical SharePoint expert. It's easy to do, it's easy to work with. It leverages the power of the Microsoft Graph API. It's got that nice little customizable interface, Lego builder type interface where you can build up your controls, paging, grouping, conditional formatting, etc. And it works seamlessly with SharePoint and Teams. So you might be able to go and look at some of our other recent webinars where we showed you using the Data View Plus and some of the other apps directly inside of Teams. So if you deploy these apps to your tenant, the Data View Plus app would also be available to be added as a tab within your Microsoft team to build out those web parts in exactly the same way.